What Aviation Week revealed on February 15, 1954, hit like a sledgehammer. The Soviet Union had jet bombers capable of striking the United States with nuclear warheads without refueling. Many dismissed it as hysteria, but when 28 Myasishchev M-4s thundered over Moscow 5 weeks later, denial collapsed. At that pace, the USSR could field more than 800 by 1960. They would be unstoppable. And what did the United States have to defend itself? An interceptor that could barely break Mach 1, obsolete before it ever flew. There was only one answer to the bomber gap, and it bordered on insanity. Build a Mach 3 super-interceptor that could chase bombers halfway across the Atlantic. By the time it blipped on their radar, the Soviets were in for something special, a nuclear-tipped telephone pole. In the mid-1950s, a sense of impending doom hung over America. The Cold War was at its iciest, and the threat of nuclear war felt not just possible, but unavoidable. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills under their desks, a useless gesture against atomic fire, while families dug fallout shelters in their backyards, stockpiling canned goods for a radioactive future. Along the 69th parallel, from Alaska to Greenland, technicians huddled in the stark, isolated outposts of the distant early warning line. Their sole purpose was to stare into the vast Arctic sky with radar, watching for the telltale blips of Soviet bombers screaming over the North Pole on a path to American cities. The fear was palpable, stoked by images from Moscow's May Day parades. Roaring over Red Square in tight formation, new long-range Soviet bombers like the Tu-16 Badger, the hulking Myasishchev M-4 Bison, and the massive turboprop Tu-95 Bear sent a clear and terrifying message. These aircraft suggested a daunting fleet capable of delivering an intercontinental nuclear threat, and American intelligence even suspected the Soviets were developing a delta-wing supersonic bomber. This growing aerial armada presented a stark and horrifying challenge for the U.S. Air Defense Command. In 1955, it had no answer. Its frontline interceptor, the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger, was already behind schedule, and more critically, could barely push past Mach 1. At that speed, an F-102 would be utterly incapable of catching the new Soviet bombers before they reached their release points. This vulnerability saturated the nation. It was called the bomber gap. In the halls of the Pentagon, U.S. Air Force leaders examined the maps, intelligence reports, and performance charts of their current fighters and came to a frightening conclusion. The existing strategy was failing. A bigger, better version of what they already had would not be enough. The threat was shifting at a staggering pace, and the only possible defense was an equally swift and revolutionary leap in technology. They came up with a new kind of fighter, an interceptor that could fly at speeds once thought to belong to sci-fi spaceships, an airframe that could travel hundreds of miles from American shores and obliterate enemy bombers long before they could reach the edge of American soil. It would be America's shield, a man guardian angel tasked with a single mission: to stop Armageddon in its tracks. The Air Force, sensing the gravity of the situation, made an impossible demand. In October 1955, it issued General Operational Requirement 114. The project was given the designation LRIX, for Long Range Interceptor Experimental. The aircraft had to be capable of sustained flight at Mach 3, roughly 2,000 miles per hour. It needed to soar to altitudes above 75,000 feet, operating in the thin, cool air at the edge of space. It demanded an all-weather capability, and most remarkably, the ability to loiter on patrol for an entire hour at these extreme speeds and altitudes, ready to engage the enemy. Its purpose was unambiguous. It had to carry armament lethal enough to reliably shoot down Soviet bombers in a single, decisive blow. Under normal circumstances, such a revolutionary and lucrative contract would have sparked a fierce, multi-year competition among America's top aerospace giants. But these were not normal circumstances. The perceived bomber gap with the Soviet Union created an extreme sense of urgency. Every month lost to a traditional design fly-off was another month America lay vulnerable. So, in an unprecedented and shocking move, the Air Force dispensed with the usual multi-company competition. In June 1957, it awarded a letter contract directly to a single company, North American Aviation. The decision infuriated many aircraft manufacturers, but NAA's pedigree spoke for itself. As the builder of the combat-proven F-86 Saberjet of Korean War fame, and the driving force behind the record-shattering X-15 rocket plane program, North American had a reputation for tackling Herculean tasks and succeeding. They were seen as the one company that could bend the laws of physics to meet the Air Force's desperate timeline. The urgency extended beyond the prime contractor. The Air Force handpicked a dream team of top subcontractors, forging a nationwide coalition of the era's brightest engineers. Hughes Aircraft, a leader in advanced electronics, was tasked with creating a revolutionary fire control radar and missile system. Convair, with its expertise in high-speed wing design, was brought on for cutting-edge wing assemblies. Marquardt was chosen to develop the complex supersonic engine inlets, while Hamilton Standard would tackle the critical crew life support systems needed to keep 2 men alive at 80,000 feet. Others were tapped for avionics and subsystems, uniting the nation's premier aerospace talent into a single, focused effort. From its inception, the North American Aviation team understood its NA-257 prototype was destined to be extraordinary. The hurdles were monumental, stretching the limits of metallurgy, aerodynamics, and propulsion. To find a starting point for even considering working at Mach 3 speeds, company engineers looked to a recent cutting-edge experiment, the X-10 drone. This unmanned rocket-like testbed, with its distinctive delta wing and canard configuration, had been developed for the now-cancelled Navajo missile program. The lessons learned from the X-10's successful high-speed flights were invaluable, offering crucial data on control and stability at speeds over twice the speed of sound. The team was led by Chief Engineer Harrison "Stormy" Storms, a creative and relentless mind who was simultaneously orchestrating the development of another Mach 3 behemoth, the XB-70 Valkyrie bomber. In fact, the Air Force envisioned the two Mach 3 giants as a nuclear-armed tag team. The B-70 would be the spear, striking into the Soviet Union at unbelievable speeds to deliver atomic strikes, while the F-108 long-range interceptor would be the shield, guarding the U.S. homeland from any retaliatory bomber attack. The XF-108 was even expected to serve as a secondary escort for the Valkyrie on its missions into enemy territory, as it was the only fighter on the drawing board fast enough to keep pace with the 2,000-plus mile-per-hour bomber. This symbiotic relationship was a key to the program's initial momentum. To save time and, crucially, cost, the two aircraft were designed to share technology. They would both be powered by the same formidable General Electric J-93 afterburning turbojets, each capable of producing around 30,000 pounds of thrust. They also shared an ingenious and desperately needed new safety system, the crew escape capsule. At 80,000 feet and Mach 3, a conventional ejection seat was out of the question. Instead, North American designed a fully pressurized, clamshell-like cabin for each crew member that would serve as a futuristic life pod, rocketing them clear of the disintegrating aircraft in an emergency. The aircraft's form, honed through endless wind tunnel tests and calculations, began with a delta wing, canard forewings, and twin vertical tails, a nod to its larger Valkyrie sibling. But as the data came in, Storm's team sculpted and fine-tuned the design. The canards were put aside to simplify and stabilize high-speed flight. The twin tails were exchanged for a single structure, a colossal vertical stabilizer, augmented by two small ventral fins beneath the wings. The wings themselves transformed into a large crank delta shape, a broad, sharply swept 65-degree inboard section for high-speed efficiency, which then changed angle to a less severe sweep outboard, complete with drooped wingtips to improve handling and control at slower landing speeds. The resulting aircraft was enormous, the largest fighter ever contemplated in the Western world at that time. The XF-108 was projected to stretch 82 feet from nose to tail, with a 57-foot wingspan, roughly double that of a contemporary F-4 Phantom II. Nearly half that weight was fuel. Carrying some 7,100 gallons internally, the Rapier was effectively a flying fuel tank, a necessity to feed its two thirsty J-93 engines during its planned all-supersonic flight pattern, in which it would cruise, fight, and return home entirely at supersonic speeds. This was a machine built for one thing: sustained, terrifying speed. The XF-108 was conceived as more than just a fast airframe. It was an integrated weapons system, where the technology was as revolutionary as its performance. To fulfill its mission of intercepting bombers hundreds of miles from American shores, often over the desolate Arctic Ocean, its sensors and armament had to be light years ahead of anything in service. The heart of this system was the radar, and the Air Force had turned to Hughes Aircraft for a solution. Hughes set to work on what would be the world's first ever pulse Doppler radar to be installed in a fighter, the AN/ASG-18. This was a massive and massively expensive piece of equipment, with an antenna so large it dictated the diameter of the Rapier's forward fuselage. It was designed to overcome the critical weakness of contemporary radars, the inability to distinguish low-flying targets from the ground clutter of reflections from the Earth below. The AN/ASG-18 could look down and pick out a bomber flying just above the waves. It was also designed to track and scan simultaneously, allowing the radar officer in the rear cockpit to search a vast 100,000 square mile sector of sky, while simultaneously guiding multiple missiles to their targets. The interceptor's primary armament was equally impressive and perfectly matched the radar's long-range capabilities. Housed internally in a rotary launcher to maintain the aircraft's sleek aerodynamic profile was a payload of 3 enormous GAR-9 Super Falcon missiles, later designated the AIM-47A. This configuration was decades ahead of its time and wouldn't be implemented again until the development of the F-22 and F-35. These were not dogfighting missiles. They were flying telephone poles of destruction. Each one measured 12.5 feet long and was propelled by a storable liquid fuel rocket motor that could push it to speeds of Mach 6, faster than a rifle bullet, across ranges exceeding 100 miles. The mission concept was chillingly simple. The pilot up front, focusing on flying the high-altitude intercept, and the radar officer in the rear, managing the weapons system. The two-man crew would fly out to the edge of radar coverage and engage Soviet bomber formations from well beyond visual range. The GAR-9 was designed to ensure success with a single shot. Each missile could be armed with either a large 100-pound high-explosive warhead or, more terrifyingly, a .25 kiloton nuclear warhead. The strategy was to shoot down enemy bombers by nuking them out of the sky. In the cold logic of the era, this made perfect sense. A near miss by a small nuclear blast would be more than enough to vaporize or structurally obliterate an entire formation of bombers, guaranteeing that not a single one could slip through to its target. While some sources claim the Rapier was designed to also carry backup armament, like shorter-range Sidewinder missiles or unguided rocket packs for closer encounters, its primary punch was always intended to be the massive GAR-9 missiles. The entire system, the Mach 3 airframe, the revolutionary pulse Doppler radar, and the nuclear-tipped Mach 6 missiles, was designed as a single cohesive unit to project American defensive power far out into the frozen north, creating a lethal barrier that no Soviet bomber could hope to cross. By January 1959, the XF-108 Rapier had moved from the realm of blueprints and calculations into tangible, three-dimensional reality. Inside North America's sprawling Los Angeles facility, the company had constructed a full-scale wooden mock-up of the enormous interceptor. For 3 weeks, this meticulously crafted model became the focus of intense scrutiny as over 70 Air Force officers, engineers, and high-ranking brass descended to conduct the mock-up review. They walked around the silent, imposing structure, which stretched nearly 90 feet long, peering into the cockpit, inspecting the weapon bay, and running their hands along the smooth lines of the fuselage and crank delta wings. They penciled in suggestions and corrections, debating every detail, from instrument placement to maintenance access panels. Impressively, the review team found very little to change. The basic configuration was deemed sound, a powerful testament to the skill and foresight of Stormy and his design team. Confidence in the project was soaring. A few months later, in May 1959, the Air Force officially christened the machine the Rapier, a name submitted by an Air Force sergeant in a service-wide contest. The moniker was fitting. A rapier is a quick, slender, and lethal dueling sword, and this aircraft was to be the USAF Swift blade to thrust at the heart of any Soviet bomber attack. Yet, even as the Rapier program reached this pinnacle of confidence, the strategic ground beneath it was shifting. In Washington, a fierce debate was raging within the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill. The successful Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 kicked off the space race, and with it, an intense focus on missile technology. A powerful faction of defense analysts and politicians began to argue that the future of warfare belonged to intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, not to expensive, high-speed airplanes. Why should the nation invest billions in a fleet of 480 Mach 3 fighters when a nuclear-tipped missile could cross the globe in minutes? Manned interceptors and bombers, they argued, were on the verge of becoming obsolete. This debate came to a head in early 1959, with the Rapier's fate hanging in the balance. Into this political fray stepped Air Force Chief of Staff General Thomas D. White. A staunch defender of the manned aircraft, White went to Capitol Hill to make a passionate case for the Rapier program. Testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee in February 1959, he warned that handing the nation's air defense entirely over to automatons would be a grave and irreversible mistake. He argued that manned interceptors were essential not only for long-range attacks, but also for the critical tasks of identification, which a simple missile could never perform. His testimony encapsulated the Air Force's deepest institutional belief in the irreplaceable role of the human element in warfare. He insisted that no purely automatic system, whether it be the Army's Nike Zeus anti-missile or the Air Force's own Bomark anti-bomber missile, could ever substitute for human reason at the point of contact. In a direct rebuke to the missile proponents, General White delivered the defining statement of the debate, telling the senators, quote, "No purely automatic system can match the judgment, flexibility, and intelligence of the man in the cockpit." His words were a powerful defense of the Rapier and the very idea of the fighter pilot, but he was fighting against a rising tide of budgetary pressure and a strategic obsession with the promise of missiles. Despite White's eloquent defense, the political and fiscal climate in Washington was turning against hugely expensive, technologically ambitious projects. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration was determined to rein in defense spending and deliver a balanced federal budget in its final year, a goal of significant political importance. His budget director, Maurice Stans, relentlessly pressured Defense Secretary Neil McElroy to find savings anywhere he could in the fiscal year 1960 defense budget. In this environment, big-ticket programs like the Rapier and its sister project, the B-70 Valkyrie, came under intense scrutiny. The estimated total cost for the F-108 program was staggering. Acquiring the planned fleet of nearly 500 fighters would run to approximately $4 billion, a sum equivalent to over $33 billion today. President Eisenhower himself balked at this figure, explicitly noting that buying 480 Rapiers would be prohibitively expensive. The sheer cost made the program a tempting target for the budget cutters. By late 1958, the pressure was already being felt. The Air Force, which had optimistically planned to purchase 31 YF-108 prototypes for testing, was forced to trim the order back to around 20, a clear signal that the program had to prove its worth quickly to survive. At the same time, the very threat the Rapier was designed to counter was being fundamentally reevaluated. For years, the bomber gap had fueled American defense planning, the fear that the Soviet Union possessed hundreds more long-range bombers than the U.S. But new intelligence, gathered by the top-secret U-2 spy plane flying at altitudes previously thought impossible, began to paint a very different picture. The U-2's high-resolution photographs revealed that the Soviets did not have a massive fleet of M4 Bison bombers after all. The Kremlin, it turned out, had masterfully duped Western observers by flying the same small group of bombers in circles during air shows to create the illusion of a much larger force. The bomber gap was a myth. The intel showed that only a few dozen of the largest Soviet bombers actually existed, and their newer models were arriving much more slowly than anticipated. This revised intelligence had profound strategic implications. The nightmare scenario of vast, unstoppable swarms of Soviet bombers, the very scenario that gave birth to the F-108, now seemed far less likely. Furthermore, by mid-1959, it was becoming clear that the Soviet Union's strategic focus was shifting decisively from manned bombers to intercontinental ballistic missiles. As one engineer on the project, Richard Schmidt, would later reflect on the program's fate, quote, "Nothing was wrong with the design. It was simply the wrong time." On September 23, 1959, the Air Force issued a terse, two-sentence public statement that shattered the dreams of thousands of engineers and pilots. It read, quote, "As of today, the Air Force contract with North American Aviation for the development of the F-108 long-range interceptor is being terminated." Just months after being proudly christened the Rapier, the program was canceled before a single rivet had been driven into a prototype. The official reason was a reappraisal of strategic priorities, a cold bureaucratic phrase that masked a profound shift in military doctrine and the harsh realities of fiscal restraint. The total research and development expenditure to that point was cited as being between $140 and $150 million in 1959 dollars, not a small sum, but only a tiny fraction of what the full program would have cost if it had continued. For the thousands of people who had lived and breathed the F-108 project for years, the news was a gut punch. At North America's Los Angeles plant, some 2,000 workers were immediately laid off. Engineers and technicians who had poured countless late nights and their brightest ideas into the Rapier now had to walk past the full-scale wooden mock-up for the last time. The once ambitious F-108 program, embodied by a sleek, gleaming white model, now lay abandoned in a hangar, destined for scrap. Colonel Kenneth O. Chilstrom, a veteran test pilot specially chosen to lead the development of this revolutionary aircraft, felt the pain of this profound disappointment. In the coming weeks, Chilstrom would be the one to literally turn off the lights on the Rapier program office before being quietly redirected to a different, highly secret Mach 3 interceptor project at Lockheed Skunk Works, the YF-12A. The cancellation of the F-108 had an immediate and devastating ripple effect on its sister program, the B-70 Valkyrie. With the Rapier gone, all the shared development costs for the powerful J-93 engines, the advanced radar systems, and the crew escape capsules now fell solely onto the Valkyrie's ledger. Roughly $180 million in expenses shifted overnight, pushing the already expensive bomber program even closer to the chopping block. Secretary McElroy immediately slashed the B-70 plan as well, reducing it from a full fleet of strategic bombers to a scaled-back experimental program of just a few research aircraft. The Air Force had tried to field a futuristic, all-star team of Mach 3 weapons, but the realities of budgets and evolving strategy meant not everyone could stay in the game. The Rapier was the odd man out. Though the North American XF-108 Rapier was cancelled on the drawing board, its ghost remained. The immense investment in its cutting-edge technology left an important and surprisingly resilient legacy that would influence aerospace design for decades to come. The Air Force and Hughes aircraft salvaged the Rapier's testing data and its most advanced components, the AN/ASG-18 pulse Doppler radar and AIM-47 Falcon missile, both too capable to abandon. A few years later, these systems found a new purpose in a top-secret project at Lockheed Skunk Works. The CIA's A-12 Oxcart, a Mach 3 Plus reconnaissance aircraft, was already taking shape under Kelly Johnson. At the Air Force's request, Lockheed developed a specialized interceptor version of that design, the YF-12A. Hughes adapted the F-108's radar and missile suite to fit the YF-12's new, even faster airframe, creating one of the most advanced interceptor prototypes ever built. In test flights starting in 1965, the three YF-12A prototypes proved the concept that the Rapier never could, successfully intercepting target drones at blistering supersonic speeds and scoring hits from ranges over 65 miles. For a brief moment, the ghost of the Rapier flew again. But politics intervened once more. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, deeply skeptical of expensive niche aircraft, canceled the planned F-12B production interceptors in 1968, denying the Air Force a Mach 3 fighter for a second time. Yet the Rapier's technological DNA lived on. The torch was carried forward by Hughes and, unexpectedly, the U.S. Navy. The experience gained from the AN/ASG-18 radar directly evolved into the AN/AWG-9, and the AIM-47 missile was scaled up to become the legendary AIM-54 Phoenix. In the 1970s, this radar and missile combination became the primary weapon system of the Navy's formidable F-14 Tomcat, giving its carrier battlegroups the unprecedented long-range punch initially envisioned to defend North American skies. Perhaps the most ironic legacy of the XF-108 emerged from the other side of the Iron Curtain. When Soviet intelligence learned of the American plans to field a Mach 3 bomber and a Mach 3 interceptor, it sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. The prospect of such impossibly fast American aircraft spurred the Soviet Air Force to initiate its own high-speed interceptor program to counter it. The result was the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat, a massive, powerful interceptor built of stainless steel to withstand the heat of high Mach flight, which first flew in 1964. The Foxbat was a brute force answer to the question the Rapier had posed. How do you catch an enemy that flies at the edge of space? In a perfect illustration of Cold War paranoia, by the time the MiG-25 entered service in the early 1970s, the B-70 program had been reduced to a footnote, and the F-108 Rapier never existed. The Soviets had built a thoroughbred interceptor, designed to chase enemies that never came. The Rapier Spectre had managed to influence the hardware of its own adversaries, a final echo of the ultimate interceptor that almost was.